kind of like the omics or the integrated holistic approach. And what it is essentially understanding metal chemistry dynamics in biological processes within the context of a complete whole functioning system. So it's really analogous to genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, lipidomics, any way that you're trying to understand from this integrated perspective the role of these components.
Science. Technology. Medicine. Health. These four things make the world go round. Without them, we couldn't exist. This is the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health, answering your questions or finding experts in the field to answer them. Your host is a pharmacist, an award-winning scientist. She leads her own research group and is the founder of King's College London Fight the Fakes. A tad bit on the qualified side. Welcome to Monday Science. Here's your host, Dr. Bahijja Raimi Abraham.
On today's episode, we have somebody who I met a few years ago. We'll talk about that. This person is amazing, has the best energy, the best laugh, and we got each other's sense of humor. Yeah. So today we have Dr. Theodora Stewart. Thea, how are you?
I am great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on and having a chat with me in this setting where other people can get an insight into our quirky conversation.
Exactly. Now it's like live in the world.
I know. We might have to censor a bit. Don't let them think we're too off center. But tell me, you've got a mug. Let's see that, your interesting mug. So it says, girls just want to have funding for their scientific research, please.
Shout out to my friend Izzy. This was the best gift ever.
Izzy, thank you. And thank you for understanding. It's funding is a topic that the listeners are aware of, that I talk about every so often. Literally, well, I don't want to say it's every episode, comes up quite a few times. My mug, mine is something about tea. Putting the tea in tea. Yes.
Oh, look at you.
Thank you. Not as apt as yours.
No, just for this.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so before we find out a bit more about you, two questions I've been asking people, because we are still in a global pandemic. It's not over. We're still there. So yeah. What's your favorite song at this moment?
My favorite song? Ooh, That's a hard one. So I'm a musician, so I pick a song right now. It is hard to pick one. I like all different types of genres, but I think my favorite group is a group out in Sweden, actually. They're very like singer-songwriter, and they're called Good Harvest. And they're just fantastic. Like singer-songwriter, two men, two guitars, and kind of talk about the whole connection with the environment and nature and their music, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So it's my balance from the chaos of London and being in the cities to have a little bit of music and nature.
That's amazing. And what about films, books? Do you have any you could recommend to our listeners?
Oh God, I don't think I'm too exhausted to read books, like proper books. And films, I love documentaries. I'm a big documentary fan on Netflix, and there are just some really great ones. The Bleeding Edge is amazing, about biomedical kind of research and all that stuff. And then there is another really good one called Diagnosis, where they do crowdsourced diagnosis of unknown diseases. It's an amazing documentary series on Netflix. Definitely recommend it.
It's so interesting what you said about book, because I was actually interested to see what your response would be when I asked if you could recommend a book, because I mean I read all the time, like work, and whereas others, and I think it's the same with you, right? When others may have their downtime with a book, I can't think of anything worse.
I'd rather stare. Actually, I like to stare at a white wall when I get home, when I'm done with work. No major screens. The screens have been killing me.
It's like, we're just there, because I've started doing that, where I just need a moment of silence, stillness. I come home and I'm like, everything off. Yeah. So it's good to know I'm not alone with not being able to sort of downtime with books. And you mentioned you're a musician.
The guitar as frequently as I used to, but yeah, I have 4 guitars in my flat, and I have my little musical corner that I've set up. So I do lots of music. The last few years I've been insanely busy with work. But yeah, I do pick it up, compose my own stuff. Maybe we'll get back into some open mics soon now that the pandemic.
You have a fan following as well. I've scoped you out on the platforms. I thought that was so cool, especially when I feel we need more examples of people who are artists and STEM professionals and are managing the world holding both.
I talk a lot, especially to like younger students and people that I mentor, that life is for living. And I think we often say like my work life and my personal life, my life, and we separate these two things as if we're two different human beings. And the reality is we're not. We're one person. And I view science and music as this beautiful kind of synergistic interaction. One kind of inspires the other. And the moment that I stopped kind of separating those two things, I was actually struggling. Do I do music or do I do science or music? And I said, okay, I'll just do both because I love both. It actually enhanced my life. It made me happy, made me feel full. And the things that I was engaging with, like, very meaningful. So I really try to emphasize to people that I talk to, it's treat everything as like integrated. Don't start to separate things out because you're only going to be feeling unhappy because there'll be this and not that or that and not this. And it's possible. I think we just think it's not possible.
I agree. I feel we need to advocate more that you can be you can be yourself, you can be individual. You don't actually have to make a choice. You just have to understand how to navigate these two worlds or whatever it is. But it's better to be yourself than to not, because at some point it's like a pressure cooker. At some point you're like, I've got to,
and my music friends are like, how's this like Metallomix thing going? And then my science buddies are like, how's the music going? And I literally brought my guitar into the office and played for my office mates before COVID and all this stuff. So like literally these two things are intertwined.
Oh, that is amazing. So you actually brought it into your guitar into work?
Of course.
If I'd known, I'd have been coming in
tomorrow.
Oh, but yeah, let's have a sing along. My favorite song is House on the Hill and Hallelujah classics. I will sing.
All right.
I've made up plans in my mind. Like when it's warm, we could go to the park. I didn't know you bring the guitar in, so I'm stuck with you forever now. Well, on that note, actually, tell us about yourself. Tell us, who are you?
Who am I? Well, as you can tell by my accent, I'm definitely not British. So I was born in the United States, come from the East Coast near Boston. So I grew up there. I also went to university there. So I went to Wellesley College, which is actually one of the only all-women's colleges left in the United States. So I had this really unique education where I was surrounded by women, type A driven women who will make a difference in the world, obviously a mixed faculty. So I had, male professors and everything. But I actually went into university thinking I would be a music major or history, and I came out analytical chemistry. Boom. So the beauty of having a liberal arts education in the United States. And I just had absolutely fantastic chemistry teachers. And I think it really goes to show how important teachers are, really at all levels, but particularly at high school and then university level. Those are those really formative years. So yeah, I basically fell in love with chemistry, went from music, took a human anatomy course because we all had to take a spectrum of courses our first year at university. And then I thought, hey, I really like this science thing, and started doing research right away my first summer. First was more into neuroscience, then shifted to biochemistry, but then realized actually there's more just the chemistry that I enjoyed. I just wanted to take chemistry classes basically. And I very much was interested not just in pure analytical chemistry, but very much applications. I've always, I think, intuitively a big picture thinker, been looking at connections between things. I've always loved the outdoors, loved nature, being outside. And so I originally was starting to look at that interface of using analytical chemistry in environmental science. So my third year at university, I actually was thinking about how I wanted to tie all these pieces together. And I wanted to go abroad. I wanted to have an experience outside of the United States. So I actually got an opportunity to do a summer of research in Switzerland at a place called EAVAG, which is Freshwater Research Institute of Switzerland. And there I was actually able to start to look at kind of metal interactions. This is my first interest in metals and trying to understand kind of bioremediation approaches to clean contaminated water from toxic metals. metals. That was basically my thought. How can we use nature, what's in nature, to basically clean up all of the contamination and damage that we've done as human beings to the planet? My naive, whatever, I don't know how old I was, like young 20-year-old self. So I came from this approach, and so I had a combination of my chemistry background, but then working with biologists, algae, and then also a bit of like physics was thrown in there as well. So I ended up coming back to the United States after that summer, turned into my bachelor's thesis, went back to Switzerland the second summer, really cultivated a great relationship with this laboratory there, and then ultimately ended up applying for a master's program at ETH, and I got a full ride to do a 2-year master's program in Switzerland at ETH in Zurich. And so I applied for this program called Biogeochemistry and Pollutant Dynamics. So a bit of everything, biology, geology, chemistry, and a little physics thrown in there. And it was quite an interesting course, but it allowed me to continue my research in that lab in Switzerland. And I moved on, I did my PhD at ETH, and then ultimately stayed 1-year postdoc in that lab. So it was really off and on there for 10 years almost. So it was a big chapter in my life in Switzerland. But always my work has been trying to understand the roles of metals in biology, coming first from this perspective of a toxic metal, like I was looking at lead, for example, and understanding the effects of lead on biofilms during my PhD, for example, but then digging in a little bit deeper and going at that cellular level and trying to understand, okay, once this toxic metals inside of a cell, how is it interacting with all of the important essential metals like the copper and the iron and the zinc? And so now I started to get interested in this interface of non-essential and essential metals. And I actually did half of my PhD at the Swiss Light Source, so the crazy synchrotron beam lines. So I got like a massive foray into the crazy world of physics and like learning to speak physics in the process. Yeah, and so that was kind of my trajectory before moving to this country. And I got a Swiss fellow and early postdoc mobility grant to actually come to King's College in the Department of Nutrition, again looking at this interaction of essential, non-essential metal homeostasis. Then this is where I actually came into contact with Professor, who's professor of Metallomix, I think technically the only one in the world, officially. He's a huge player in the field, and we started to interact more. And this is really the first time that I began to realize that what I had been doing my whole career was Metallomix. But he was able to beautifully articulate this field in a new way that I had never thought of before, and really opened up kind of like doors for my imagination. And then about a year at King's, they got a Wellcome Trust grant, he and some people at Imperial, to create a London Metallomics Facility. And I was approached and asked if I would apply for it because I had this quite a unique combination of being at this interface of chemistry, biology, and physics that's required for something like this. And I was dying living in London. I was missing my mountains and my fresh water and my clean water, fresh air. But I thought, like, I looked at this proposal and this grant, and I thought, oh God, this is the perfect position. It just happens to be in London. So I ended up applying for it as a 4-year post. And kind of things snowballed into where I am now, which is the lead scientist and manager of the London Metallomics Facility. So that was a very long answer to your question, but that's trajectory.
It's amazing. I'm blown away. I have many questions. One, and this is not to take away everything that you've asked. I've never understood the American education system. So you call it college university. Hello, American listeners. Thank you for listening. Please stay. Yeah. I mean no offense. I'm so sorry. I just mean college is a university. And how long, because what I'm trying to understand, because it seems as if you were able to, even with your initial choice for your starting degree, let's say, you were still able to be, going back to that earlier discussion of being all of yourself, and then have that flexibility and journey throughout in the UK. As you start your degree, that topic, that's it for life. I mean, it's not for life, but for the duration of your university experience. And then if you want to go to another course, you've got to leave that course and maybe even start again, or you can't just hop in. So I just want to have an understanding of that, because I have many questions, but that I think would be quite important and helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just something kind of unique in the United States. You go into college or university. I mean, it depends on the size. The college that I went to, 2,000 students versus a massive university, but the level and the age and the degree is the same. But you go in having a sense of what you want to do, but you do have flexibility within your first, I would say, 2 years before you declare your major, quote unquote. So you have an ability to actually take a wide range of courses, particularly in your first year. And I think it's insane, especially in the UK and Europe in general, that I don't know how old you're, 18 or whatever or less, that you need to decide what you want to do for the rest of your life. Like, who knows at that age?
I just want to interject and say, I still don't know. Hello, thanks. Please continue. Help.
So I actually think it's a fantastic kind of setup the United States has in that sense of giving a student the flexibility to explore a little bit, right? And obviously having good teachers helps your trajectory and what you are ultimately interested in doing. And I was fortunate to have amazing teachers. But yeah, it is definitely unique.
I think that's amazing. And I can also see how, particularly with your experience and having that freedom from mine, I mean, I'm gonna ask you to define Metallomix shortly, but from my understanding of Metallomix, because maybe that term relatively new in the grand scheme of, if we're to compare the term chemistry versus Metallomix, that's new. and in a way, it seems as if people who work within this space have to have a lot of flexibility and be open-minded without restrictions. And I can see how you would have been the perfect person to lead the facility by virtue of having that. And even I know we've had scientific conversations, and I was like, oh yeah, you can see that the diversity of thought is important in being able to actually put together something to get the real science, as it were. So what is Metallomix?
I will tell you what Max is, but I actually want to respond to your comment because I think it's incredibly important within the larger context of science. What we're seeing now that's really required to propel science forward is new connections and an integration and a synthesis across a wide-ranging, diverse amount of fields. And I think what we're running into is you have those people that are specialists and are able to look at their one topic, but a lot of people struggle to see connections. And I think that it's something I actually haven't thought about until you put it this way, that having that flexibility to be able to be imaginative and creative in my earlier years, I think really set a powerful foundation for the way that I interact with science in general. And it's a struggle even trying to find people to hire into the Metallomix facility, to find those people that are able to very fluently bridge those gaps. You don't need to be an expert in a field, but to understand enough of the language to be able to start to kind of make intuitive syntheses of things is incredibly important. So for all those young people, build your own scientific fields.
Honestly, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday. I feel for me, my journey over the last year and a bit I came to the realization, I was already on this journey before, as you would know, that I have my own, I'm just going to do it. If the platform needs to be created, I'll create it and I'm going to do it. But the last year and a bit, that's grown a bit more. I'm just like, let's just do it, right? There shouldn't be, I feel like a lot of people who come into science with a creative background and a creative arm. I mean, I think I've talked about this in the podcast before, why I got into research was because when I started my undergrad research project, it was the first time that I realized you could be creative in science, because up until that point, I felt that I'd just been taught to try and conform. And that was very frustrating for me. So I'm struggling here. And true research to me is art. You really you shouldn't have a limit in your ideas of what you want to do. However, when you do have that approach, it can be very hard to find people to work, because even if there's a whole thing about creating teams, right? And I know Myers-Briggs, not everybody loves it, but if you have the idea, if you've got people with different personality types, and then you have somebody who's more creative, and you need not everybody can be creative in a team. Supposedly, that's what they say. But I think it can be quite hard if people don't have an element of flexibility and creativity within a team when you're trying to achieve big things, because they will then keep saying no. And I'm not saying, and of course, we don't always need to be around yes people, but there are times when you're coming up with an idea, I don't need to hear, oh, I don't think it's possible. I just need to be like, let's try it and see, which is how I knew, which is how I knew we would get on, because this is what I'm trying to do. And you're just like, I don't really know, but let's try and see. I was like, okay, sounds great.
I think so Phil Blower mentor over at St. Thomas's, he is kind of a role model for me in a certain way. The way of how he created his department. And he said something to me once, and I don't know if Phil, you'll be watching this, but it really stuck with me because he said, look, I never say no to someone who comes to me with an idea. It's always yes, but it's a matter of when, how, and the timing of it. And I was like, that is spot on right? Because you can't say yes to everything all the time and do it right. But there's that really important distinction of always being open and always hearing and trying to be solution oriented to understand how to do something, when it can be done and how it can be done. And that's always really powerful in that stuff.
I agree, and I like that. I'll take that on board as well, because I didn't realize that I was starting to do that, where it's just trying to understand where that activity fits in the timeline to achieve what you want to achieve. Yep. It's not a matter of it's not possible, it's just when. But yeah, probably need to have another conversation about teamwork, academics. So, let's get back to that. Moving on, please define Metallomix. What is it? Actually another thing is, I love word plays. How many words is Metallomix bringing together?
2 maybe. Metals and omics, right? Like kind of like the omics, or the integrated holistic approach. And what it is essentially understanding metal chemistry dynamics in biological processes within the context of a complete whole functioning system. So it's really analogous to genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, lipidomics, any way that you're trying to understand from this integrated perspective the role of these components. So that's really what it is. And what I've been involved in is really developing all the analytical tools that are cutting edge, that can underpin a massive range of different scientific questions that come from this field of metallomics. And so maybe just to highlight a couple of examples. If you take vitamin B12, for example, not many people realize this, but there's a cobalt at the center of vitamin B12. And without that cobalt, it doesn't do what it needs to do biologically, right? So that cobalt imparts the function within that vitamin B12. If you take an example of zinc, zinc is involved in almost every single biological process and function, from genome to metabolome. And we're just beginning to understand really the significance of it. But one example is within the context of insulin and diabetes. Not many people realize when insulin is stored in our bodies, in the pancreas and beta cells, it's actually stored in a kind of a crystalline form, and zinc is the one thing that is holding the hexamer together. So without zinc, we have no way of storing insulin in our body. So people just don't really realize these absolutely pivotal fundamental roles of metals in normal function. Now you start to move on to human health and disease, and then understanding the roles become even more significant, because what we've begun to see more and more is dysregulation of the metals, the irons, the coppers, the zincs, the important metals, actually can lead to disease. They're not just a consequence of disease. And so it's becoming more paramount importance to truly understand the function of these at that mechanistic level, because as you can imagine, right, a whole host of potential new therapies and diagnostics tools and approaches, I think, can become available. So at the LMF and kind of going forward, it's really looking at all the technology that we can continue to develop so that we can do analyses within the context of these scientific questions.
Amazing. And because I have so many questions, there's something, as you were talking, and I'm just thinking back to your mug. This is a random segue, but thinking back to your mug, and thank you, yes. And also just taking on board what you said around what Metallomix is and the importance, and that's what drew me to want to be interested in the technique anyway. And I'm a big fan. It's like a fan of your instruments. That's a weird thing to say, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Have a nice sing along tomorrow. But I feel, it always feels to me that the limitation in science, as we know, is funding, right? And also having people think that your idea is important enough to get funded, let's say. Studying metals, because when you were talking, I remember with my social enterprise DMed collective a few years ago, which was all about, it's still about engaging the public with STEM research through art, particularly street art. I curated a astrophysics wall in Brockley, part of Brockley Street Art Festival 2015, I think it was. And one of the academics, he had discovered a supernova. That was the first supernova to be discovered in like the last 40 years of that time. And one of the things we learned was that supernovas emit different elements depending on the supernova and depending on the solar system, the elements is usually a reason why the life force is the way it is. So that supernova in particular emits iron. And I remember when he said, we were at the observatory in, I think it's Mill Hill, and he was just explaining this to us, and he said, yeah, so that's why we have iron in our blood. And we were like, what? So you mean to tell me, but he said it so casually, is that why we have, I said, so we have iron in our blood because of the supernovas, like they emit various different elements, and there are other elements that obviously are emitted. And it was like, wow, it blew my mind. And we wanted to write supernova in our blood, but apparently that didn't go down well with the neighbors. So we went supernova in our heart. But it just shows, again, when you're talking about like how iron is, I'm sorry, not iron, sorry, elements and metals and everything. But the one thing that I was just thinking as you were talking was that, but isn't it a shame that funding would prevent everybody from exploring this opportunity, because there might be a gateway that says, no, we don't think that's an interesting thing to investigate. Whereas to me, especially in health and disease, if we could look at the metals, I'm thinking of it from another therapeutic and with sort of my pharmacist and pharmaceutical scientist. Yep. If you have an understanding of how metals are interacting in the body, you can figure out which channels, which receptors to focus on and target. And so therefore, if you have more targeted drug delivery, you have less side effects, less adverse effects. But to me, but maybe you've caught me on a bad day, but to me, I just feel that the hindrance would be trying to get that funding, because not all new techniques are embraced in science. Yeah, but let me know what you think about, because I might be just a bit of a...
I think it brings back to this point of, how do you convey your science? How can you articulate your science? And I think this is unfortunately a weakness that's often observed in scientists, that we're interested in what we're doing, and we, for whatever reason, we find often an inability to express what we're doing in a way that is understandable, accessible, but does not dumb it down and still makes it intelligently articulated. And I think a lot of it is just not allowing ourselves enough time and space to actually reflect on how do we want to articulate what we're doing, and asking ourselves, why am I doing what I'm doing, and why is what I'm doing important? Like, really, not just the talking points that you put on, really, like, so that it grabs you. Something like, wow, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's not something I'm making it up. This is something that is like really based in reality. And I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this. I spent a lot of time writing and rewriting sentences and tweaking things, and until I can get the articulation of Metallomix and what it really means in a way that I feel like you feel like that's it. This is like, woof. And I think it's just the pressure, right? You have research and but I think the reality is that we need to allow ourselves and carve out some time to give ourselves space to do that and to think and to be creative. Because if you are able to capture that in writing and articulate that in a powerful way in a grant, you will get the funding. You will get the funding. That's really what it comes down to. It doesn't matter what you're doing and what you're doing with and what the technique is. And obviously having Metallomix as this like new thing and exciting and novel, that helps, but that doesn't detract from the point of the way that I've been articulating, because Metallomix has been around for 10 plus years, right? But the way in which I feel that I put it, the context, which just came kind of intuitively to me, is eliciting all of this incredible response and excitement, enthusiasm that I don't think was there previously, because I've just the whole field in like that big picture context, and people now are starting to see that. So it's about putting the context of your research into a larger vision and a larger picture that you can articulate. I think more of the focus has to be on that, and not just lamenting that there's not enough money, because if you're focusing on that, you're focusing on the wrong thing. That's how I truly feel. I think as a facility manager, obviously people come and they don't have funding and I'm in a situation where I try to talk about money as the last thing. We obviously have to charge for services, but I'm very keen going forward to try to figure out new mechanisms where we can, say, once a month, do some free pilot work for a PI or for a researcher has a really strong desire to write a grant.
I will accept that offer. Thank you. And thanks, friend.
But it's something that has been brought up, actively wanting to pursue and see if we can come up with some solutions. Because often what it takes really is like that one image that you can put into a grant, what we're doing, and it completely transforms the outcome of the grant. And then that's the catapult that then allows a researcher to do more research and get more funding. So it's just that initial threshold to get over.
You've been listening to the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health. We hope you've gotten some useful and thought-provoking info from the show, and we hope you had fun along the way. We know we did. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on our website at www.mondaysciencepodcast.com. Shoot us an email at info@mondaysciencepodcast.com. Find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Monday Science, and access episode summaries at mondayscience.medium.com. See you next week on the Monday Science Podcast.